You're listening to Soundside. I'm Bill Radke, in for Libby Denkman. You know who we haven't discussed on this show in a while? The second biggest private employer in our state, the Boeing Company. And it's good we haven't talked about them because when we do, it's usually bad news. The fatal crashes a few years ago, the door panel blowing out last year, production problems, machinist strike. The Senate held a whistleblower hearing, and the title was Examining Boeing's Broken Safety Culture, First-Hand Accounts. Not a great look. So, how's Boeing doing lately? Well, the stock price is up. Qatar Airlines is buying a lot of new jets. Boeing might not face criminal charges after all for those fatal crashes. That is something the victims' families are quite upset about. Well, let's catch up on Boeing now with Seattle Times business reporter Lauren Rosenblatt and aviation analyst Richard Aboulafia, managing director of AeroDynamic Advisory. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Richard, where would you say Boeing is in its recovery now?
I think they're on track. There's almost something kind of reassuring about it, frankly, because for many years, many of us, wasn't just me, many observers of the company had said this company's culture is badly off the rails. And of course, there were some tragic events that accentuated that very point. And that leadership problem started at the very top. But now you've got a completely new leader. He's actually, oh my goodness, from the industry, shock.
Mm-hmm.
And the results are speaking for themselves. They're getting to where they want to be on rate. They won the most important new combat aircraft program competition in many years. Obviously enormous challenges ahead, but they're definitely heading back on the right track.
Lauren, what's your take?
Yeah, so a couple of things to add to what Richard said. I think the analyst perspective is that Boeing is making progress on some of the milestones that it's laid out. The company has said several times that it's seeing improvement from changes it made following the Alaska Airlines panel falling off last year. After that incident, they submitted a quality and safety plan to the Federal Aviation Administration, and that laid out 6 key performance indicators that it was going to use to guide its production processes moving forward. So the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, and other executives have consistently said that they're seeing progress on those benchmarks, and that they're slowly increasing the rate of production, particularly for the 737 MAX. The FAA capped that production at 38 planes per month following the panel blowout. And since then, they've been steadily increasing production rates, and Boeing hopes to reach that this year. They'll ask the FAA for approval when they feel they've hit all the benchmarks to do so.
A big marker of the beginning of hard times for the Boeing company was 2018, 2019, when those 2 737s went into the ocean. Hundreds of people died. Boeing agreed eventually to plead guilty to fraud for hiding information about its flight control software. But now the government appears to be dropping the charges. What happened?
So basically, since that criminal charge was filed, dating back to 2021, Boeing and the Justice Department entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. So that would have allowed Boeing to avoid a criminal conviction if it met certain conditions for a 3-year period. A lot of those conditions focused on improving quality and compliance, and ensuring that it was telling the FAA everything it was doing. Right before that deal expired, the Alaska Airlines incident happened. So that kind of reopened some scrutiny into that deal. So the Justice Department determined that Boeing violated the original agreement, which kicked off the series of events that we've had over the last several months. Last summer, like you said, Boeing did agree to plead guilty, and came up with a new agreement with the Justice Department, but the Texas judge later rejected that deal. And then just this last week, Boeing and the Justice Department reached another deal, this time called a non-prosecution agreement. And in that one, the Justice Department would drop the criminal charge and Boeing would agree again to certain conditions. This one, the deal is not yet finalized, but the details that we know of now, according to court records, would require Boeing to pay a total of $1.1 billion, including additional compensation for the families that lost loved ones in the crashes, and more investment in its quality and compliance programs. A judge, the same Texas judge, still would need to approve that deal, so it's not a guarantee yet. And the attorneys representing the victims' families have said they intend to ask the judge to reject it. They don't think that it holds Boeing accountable.
These families have been pushing for that accountability and for prosecution for years. Many of them, through their attorneys, are not happy. Can you say more about what their argument is and what they can do about the situation, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, they have said from the beginning with the deferred prosecution agreement that they don't feel it does enough to hold Boeing accountable. A lot of them would like to see a trial that includes Boeing executives. I think they want a lot of information, or they want the chance for information to come to light. And they just don't feel that this would be enough to push for lasting change at the company. They have been meeting with the Justice Department pretty consistently. So that's their avenue for voicing their concerns and their opinions. And the Justice Department has said they're considering the victims' families' input when making decisions about how to move forward with Boeing. So at this stage, they can appeal to the judge in Texas to ask that he doesn't accept this agreement. And it's kind of unclear what would happen then. There's seemingly a lot of options, but that's where they're at right now.
Richard, do you agree that the lack of a criminal charge would not be enough to push Boeing into making lasting change?
I would like to see a little more clarity. I understand the pain and frustration that's driving the families of the victims to demand prosecution, but I think I'd like to see a clear statement of the end game here. And Lord knows there probably should be. It would be great to see some structural change, some greater representation for engineers, clear lines of communication between top management and engineering. It's wonderful that for the first time in many years you've got an engineer at the very top, but it would be good to see some change in the way the company is structured that allows greater communication between the people who run the show at the top and the engineering core, along with the machinists too. So in particular, one idea that's been mooted is maybe a rotating seat between machinists and engineers on the board. Wonderful idea. So I guess understanding all the pain, it would be great if they were to come up with, this is what we really want the company to do beyond just the trial.
Mm-hmm.
Something that the families have asked for as well is an independent monitor. So a third party that's not connected to Boeing that would oversee the company's compliance efforts. That was a part of the plea deal that was agreed to in the summer. And that monitor would be required to report to the court and have some, certain reports that it would have to finalize. The judge rejected that plea deal partly because of the way the monitor would be selected. He felt the court didn't have enough input, and also didn't like that the Justice Department said it would consider diversity in that selection process. This new agreement, the latest agreement, would have an outside consultant. So it's a little different, but not exactly what the first one had, but another kind of oversight mechanism.
Would it be fair to call this emerging new agreement between Boeing and the Justice Department, is this the Trump administration going easier on Boeing than the Biden administration did? Is this some signal of a new Trump administration approach to monitoring businesses, or is this just of its own piece?
Look, in an ideal world, you'd have a separation between judicial decisions and executive branch decisions. That might not always be possible. So we don't know, but I would hope this change in tack would be divorced from the administration. That's not supposed to be the way it works.
Right. Speaking of regulators, Boeing used to be able to certify its own planes as airworthy, and the FAA took that privilege away. Now the FAA has to do the certifying. Do you think this FAA will reverse itself on that? And how important is this to the company?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a much broader conversation, I think, even than that, because, of course, one of the changes in Washington is an attack on the administrative state, which means, will there be enough FAA people to do this? Hand certify each of the 737 Maxes, as well as proceed with 737 Max 7 and 10 certification on track, and looming largest 777X certification. There's a somewhat diminished and badly demoralized FAA workforce that can't have a good impact on any of this. Now, for the company, perhaps on the positive side, maybe there'll be pressure on the from the administration on the FAA to relax this, but I don't think that would be seen in a politically positive light. So, while they might have a propensity for deregulation, that might be not something that would be politically savvy of them.
Lauren, any thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing to add. I don't know about reauthorizing Boeing to self-certify some of the airworthiness of some of its planes, but in a recent safety report that Boeing releases annually now following the MAX crashes, they talked about some changes they've made to that program overall. One of the concerns with that program was that the Boeing employees who were performing tasks on behalf of the FAA felt like they were facing undue pressures, how Boeing describes it. Basically, that they couldn't point out that there was a problem with a part or a process because they felt they would face retaliation if they did. So that's been something that this program has faced for a while. But last year, Boeing made some changes to it to decrease the number of employees that felt there was that undue pressure when they were working on behalf of the FAA. So a 2024 survey led by Boeing found that 9% of respondents said they had experienced perceived interference last year, compared to 12% in 2023 and 14% in 2022. So they're seeing some improvement on that front. They changed the structure a little bit so that those employees would be able to report concerns to someone that's not their direct manager, so their employment wouldn't be tied up in what they were finding. So Boeing feels that they're seeing some improvement on that front.
Some good news for Boeing came when Qatar Airlines decided to make the biggest purchase of Boeing planes ever, 210 jets. Sounds like a big deal to me, Richard. How big is it for Boeing's recovery?
Well, not to throw any cold water on this, but first of all, we've got a supply constrained environment here, which means the problem isn't demand. A lot of people are waiting patiently for their jets. They would like them. And the 787 also has to be, has all kinds of hurdles to jump through and to keep it from getting to the production rate they would like to get to, first to, ideally 10 per month. So it's a nice endorsement. Qatar Airways has big ambitions, always has, and they tend to order very large numbers of both Airbuses and Boeings. Maybe they'll keep growing, maybe they won't. The old joke is if an airline makes money, it orders planes, and if it keeps making money, it takes delivery of those planes. There isn't necessarily a connection. So headlines, great, very endorsed. Trump can show it as a big endorsement of his visit, but in terms of commercial meaning, well, we can recount the total numbers when the last one is delivered in 2037.
Okay. Well, speaking of Qatar's ambitions, as you said, and headlines, what did either of you think of the Trump acceptance of a 747 from Qatar, and saying that Boeing failed on that project?
Yeah, that was theater. I mean, and a potentially very expensive theater for the taxpayer, because the jet itself is going to have to be stripped down to nothing. And then that's when they get to the hard work, which is actually installing the encrypted communications, battle management, and survivability equipment needed to make it an Air Force One. By then, VC-25B, the Boeing program of record, will have delivered the jets it's supposed to, raising the question of why spend the additional billions on this jet. And we're getting so many contradictory messages from the Trump White House. None of it makes any sense whatsoever. And the idea that, no, he likes the look of it so we can get in and fly it. No, that is a massive security risk. Please don't do that. Anyone going on that jet should probably carry a burner phone and whatever else. I mean, it's just bizarre. The whole thing is bizarre.
Lauren, you have been writing about Boeing's company culture. A lot of employees have said, again, that they don't trust their leadership still, and they've accused management of prioritizing production speed over safety. But Boeing says it's been trying to make strides when it comes to trust and company culture. What is your take on Boeing culture now?
That's a really tough one. I guess what I would say is most of the experts that I've talked to and who, focus on aviation safety and have followed Boeing for a very long time, have simply said that it takes a long time to change the culture, and will take a lot of time to rebuild that trust in senior leadership, especially. There's been, obviously the MAX crashes and the door plug rattled the workforce. But on top of that, there was a pretty big machinist strike last year, which the feelings from that one went back several years from the last contract that they had negotiated when Boeing threatened to take some of the work outside of the Puget Sound region. So a lot of workers were still really upset about that. So there were a lot of really intense feelings in the summer, and through the fall as that strike went on. So they resolved that strike and had a new contract, but I think some of those feelings just take a while to go away. And I've heard from some workers, that Kelly Ortberg has come in and they like his messaging. He's saying a lot of the right things. They like the approach and the new culture, but that they're waiting to see a little bit more and kind of still hesitant. So I think it just takes a little bit of time. And then Boeing did a survey of its employees, which had some mixed results. But one of the really stark statistics that came out of it was that only 27% of participants said they would highly recommend Boeing as a place to work.
Richard, Boeing's leaders have been promising a culture change for a long time. We are returning to our roots. We're refocusing on engineering over profits. How true do you think that is? And ultimately, how important do you think that is?
It's slow. I mean, I think Lauren got it right. It's really slow. It's incredibly important, though. I mean, another great saying is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it really does. See, you've got Kelly Ortberg, first engineer they've had in a while, airplane person. People in the industry really like him, comes in, does the right thing, says, I don't care where the headquarters is. I'm moving to Seattle where the problems are. Fantastic. Lay it on me. Then you got this, basically what should have been a 53-hour strike that was somehow crammed into 53 days. That was bizarre. So it's a couple steps forward, maybe a step or two back. A lot of people still there who perhaps shouldn't be, because he's moving slowly, maybe because he has to move slowly. We don't know, in terms of making personnel changes and adding people or subtracting people. And no doubt this is true at the mid level too. So you can't just wave a magic wand with culture, right? And a lot of things have to happen before the culture changes in a meaningful way. He's moving the ship in the right direction, but there's so much work to be done. What
grade do you give Kelly Ortberg so far?
A solid gentleman's B. Now, having said that, I would argue Dave Calhoun was perhaps maybe the worst CEO the industry had ever seen, period. So a B is really good, but with the potential to be higher, and again, we don't know how much of that is him and how much of that is other powers that be, whether it's the board, investors, whatever else that are tying his hands in a couple of things, or because he feels he needs to move slowly to collect all the data and make sure he does the right thing. I don't know, but so far it's a shall we say a promising B.
Lauren, you're on the Boeing beat. What would you say is the biggest challenge or the biggest shoe to drop? What is most important to you right now as you're watching this company try to get back on its feet?
Wow, that's a big question. I think I'm always someone that, really enjoys talking to workers and writing about the workforce. So I think the biggest thing I'm paying attention to is how workers are feeling about this journey that Boeing is on in terms of culture transformation, both with trusting leadership and improving its safety and quality, and just really eager to see how workers feel it is going.
Lauren, after that door panel blew out on the Alaska flight over Portland last year, regulators looked hard at a Boeing supplier in Kansas who did a lot of their manufacturing. They're called Spirit Aerosystems. Boeing spun them off 20 years ago. Where is Boeing in trying to bring Spirit back in-house?
Yeah, so last year Boeing said it was going to acquire Spirit again. So Spirit builds a lot of the parts for Boeing planes, including the fuselage for the 737. So Boeing wants to bring it back in-house to, I think the word they've used is align all their priorities and improve the quality and safety processes at Spirit as well. So that acquisition is moving along. I think they're aiming for sometime later this year still, but that's been a little bit delayed. The most recent update is that Airbus, Boeing's competitor in Europe, has reached an agreement with Spirit to acquire the parts of the company that was supplying Airbus planes. So they're kind of splitting Spirit into different pieces because it made parts for different manufacturers. So now that the Airbus piece has been finalized, it can allow the Boeing piece to move along, but it's still in regulatory review.
Richard, the idea of bringing Spirit Aerosystems back in-house, I would think, aligns with the story of realignment and getting quality control back under control. But I don't know, how much do you think buying back Spirit Aerosystems helps Boeing's quality issues?
It's repairing a very bad self-inflicted wound. I mean, not only did they spin it off 18, 19 years ago, they then decided to use it as something between a punching bag and an ATM, or maybe an ATM punching bag. I don't know. But basically they said, okay, whenever you make any money, we're taking it under programs like Partnering for Success and all this other stuff. If there's leftover sheet metal on the floor, we're taking it. That's ours. In other words, they made it uninvestable. And of course, guess what? After COVID, after the MAX shut down, for some reason, the company was having a hard time getting the resources it needed to do the ramp. That's what happens if you treat something like a punching bag. So as a result, yes, in order to get the thing back up and running, to get the great fuselage machine back up and running and make sure it has the resources it needs to be brought back in-house. That's what happens if you do something that makes it uninvestable. So here we are.
Finally, you two, we are giving KUOW listeners a snapshot of where this very important company is. What have I not asked you, or what have we missed? What do our listeners need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to back up a little, the big picture is maybe ironic or a little bit of a bummer or something. I don't know. For many years, this company really did a number on itself, thanks to very, very poor leadership decisions. But the macro environment was fantastic. Couldn't have been better. Free trade, economic growth, all of those good things. And now you have leadership that is doing smart stuff and putting the company back on track. But the macro factors, a trade war with China, one of their biggest single customers, potential for inflation, potential for stagflation, higher interest rates, damage to the entire supply chain from all of this tariff nonsense. It's almost like some sort of inverse effects thing. The company does well, and the rest of the world goes to pot, or the company does poorly, and the rest of the world prospers. So it's a bit of a reverse.
Seattle Times business reporter Lauren Rosenblatt and aviation analyst Richard Aboulafia, managing director of AeroDynamic Advisory. Thank you for this Boeing update. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, really great to be on.
And you may have caught Richard referring there to tariff nonsense. Well, since we recorded that conversation yesterday, we've got some news. You may have heard a judicial panel declared many of President Trump's tariffs illegal. So that has shaken up global trade yet again, and that affects Boeing and its workers and all of us. So we reached back out to Richard Aboulafia and said, what do you think? And he told us, quote, it may be a temporary relief from a massive self-inflicted wound, but it's better than no relief, and it might well prove permanent. So we'll stay on top of the tariff story and keep you posted.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.